Hey folks, welcome back. This week we're going to start talking about typography and type in general. And there's a lot that goes into typography. And there's really kind of a couple different schools. We're going to talk about typography in the sense of using it to design, along with imagery or in a layout or a type spread with headlines and paragraphs, things like that. There's another school of typography where it's actually the designing of type, creating typefaces and font families and all that kind of stuff. And that is a very in-depth field. And you'd probably take several classes on typography if that's what you wanted to get into. And there, on the first couple pages of the chapter, there's a lot of different things. It talks about the different parts of letters, the bowls, legs, vertexes, shoulders, back, counters, eyes, all these different things. And look at that just so you can kind of understand the different parts of a letter. Most of them make sense. Like a leg is the part of a letter that comes down. But that's a whole different thing. We're not going to get into that too much. And right now, BCTC doesn't have a typography class that specifically deals with that. I'm kind of pushing for that. I don't know if I have the power to get that involved, but I'm trying, because I think it's really important to understand all the different aspects of type. And I'm going to cover as much as I can in the 2 weeks that we have. We're going to be talking about it. But we're basically just going to be able to scratch the surface. So if you're interested in this, then I highly suggest you delve further into it and see what else you can find out. So a lot goes into typography design. The main things that I want you to worry about are the two main types of fonts. And this is kind of the way I was taught, so I want to pass that on, and it makes sense to me. We're not going to worry about all the different parts of the letter, although I do want you to look at it. But the two main types of fonts are serif and sans serif. And serifs are just these little decorative things on letters that kind of separate the two types of fonts. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. Fonts like Times New Roman or Century Old Style, Baskerville, Bodoni, all these fonts have serifs on them. And believe me, as you continue your design career, you will become very familiar with the different fonts, and you'll see signs and billboards, and you'll automatically know, like, oh, that's Arial condensed, and it's you'll see. Anyway, this is a serif over here. These little flourishes that kind of pop out, and these help whenever a letter is small. This helps with the legibility, helps your brain to process it better, helps you to read, and helps create this kind of rhythm and balance in the type. And then over here is the sans serif, and that's just a block text, used a lot for headlines. You can use it for blocks of text, like paragraph text, but it's kind of harder to read. It's a little harder for the eye to process. So typically, serif text is what's used in blocks of copy, like in textbooks or articles, things like that. Look at any newspaper; they use serif text for all their articles. They might use sans serif for the headlines because it's blockier and there's going to be more black and it's going to get your attention. But usually serif is used for body copy. Let's talk a little bit about font size. Typically, when you're reading a block of text, the font size is going to be somewhere between 9 and 12, 13 points. Okay, and a point is just it's a system that has been developed to talk about font sizes. Instead of using 1/7 of an inch or something like that, they use points. There's 72 points in an inch in the current modern system. And the actual origin of this goes way back to printing on an old press, back when typography was first being created. So at a reading size, 9 to 12 points is pretty comfortable for the eye. You want to create this. The book talks about this neutral gray density, and basically that just means it's kind of like positive negative balance. You want the white spaces in between the letters to be roughly equal to the black spaces created by the letters. And this creates this kind of neutral density, so it doesn't distract from the viewer reading, that you don't start paying attention to the actual letter forms and the shapes or the spaces in between them, because you're just, it doesn't distract you, so you can just focus on what the words are saying. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute, and all the different things to take into account when you're designing blocks of text. So the larger the type gets, whenever you get above that size, there's usually type is broken down to three sizes. Smaller than 9 point is usually caption size. That's what you'd put as a caption under a picture, or the boilerplate, a disclaimer at the bottom of an advertisement or something like that. Then there's text size, is usually 9 to 12 or 13 point. And above like 14 point is what we call display type, and that's used for headlines or maybe subheads, different sections of an article. So that's kind of the three main sizes of type. The larger the type gets, the more it really kind of becomes part of the design. The more you start to notice the angles of the different parts of the letter, and the flourishes really kind of becomes an element of the design. And that's really powerful. Whenever you get really large letters, you can kind of start to play with these different shapes and the negative space and move things around. In logo design, that's very important because you really kind of want to customize the text so it fits with your brand, but we'll talk about that. So you start to notice little individual aspects of all these letters the bigger it gets. And also the bigger it gets, it becomes more important to pay attention to the spaces between letters. A couple terms I want you to understand are leading and kerning, or tracking. Tracking is another name for kerning. Leading is the space in between lines of text. And it got its name from back when text actually had to be set manually. They'd have little metal blocks with the letter on it, and they'd place each one individually. And to get that space between lines, they would actually use a thin strip of lead. So obviously the more space between lines, the more strips of lead you would use, and so that's how leading came around. Just a little tidbit for you. And tracking, or kerning, is the space in between each individual letter. And like I said, most typefaces have tried to deal with this, but there's always going to be little anomalies. So you're always going to want to pay attention to the space between letters. Not so much in a paragraph, because the letters are small enough, they kind of go together, don't have to worry about it as much, as long as it's readable, as long as it's legible, not too squished together or too far apart. You still want them to be read as words and not just individual letters. But whenever you start talking about headlines and larger type, you really want to pay attention to the kerning in between these letters, so that you can, so there's not a big space in between two letters and two are closer together. You really kind of want to create that rhythm throughout, regardless of whether it's, in a paragraph or in a headline. I did a little printout so you could see. Leading, obviously, is the space in between these lines of type, and then kerning is the actual space in between each individual letter. So that's that. Let's see. Talked about reading size. The smaller the type gets, this kind of, is just logical, makes sense. The smaller the type gets, the more you kind of want to spread the letters out, because your eye, they turn into little dots almost, so that whenever they're spread out a little bit more, then you can read them easier. And, conversely, whenever you blow up type, make it a lot bigger, you want to squeeze the letters together a little bit, because those spaces in between the letters become more pronounced. So, all right. So we talked about the kinds of fonts, serif and sans serif. Those are the two main things. Within that, there are different other kinds of fonts, and each one of them kind of carries a certain feeling with them. A serif is typically formal kind of font. Sans serif is more modern, typically. Then you have your script fonts that are kind of reminiscent of the French Renaissance or something like that. They're used a lot in wedding invitations and things that want to be really classy and formal. You have graphic fonts, which are typically the ones that look obnoxious whenever they're not used correctly. Fonts like papyrus or sand, or just these fonts that are more graphic than actually legible, like a regular font should be. And I strongly oppose using these fonts when you design, just because it's generally a sign of an inexperienced designer. When you just put this font up there because it's cute or funny, it detracts from the whole design. That's my own belief. So they wouldn't be there if they didn't serve some sort of purpose.